So now let's have a button for deleting the transaction. So I'm going to create a button after this span button, and the class name is going to be delete button, because this button is for deleting, and I have made this class inside app.css. So it's going to be delete button, and we're just going to have a capital X inside it. Okay, so now when the user clicks this button, we want to delete the transaction. So we'll do onClick, and we need to pass in we want to create a delete transaction action now inside Redux. So let's go ahead and do this. So we'll copy this, paste it, and we'll do, instead of add, we'll do delete, capital, sorry. And we'll copy this and paste it here, and we need to copy this as well and make a new one and do delete transaction, and also pass in the transaction. Type is not going to be add transaction now, it's going to be delete transaction, and also the payload would be the transaction. Actually, we'll be receiving the ID of the transaction, so just call it transaction ID, and we'll copy this, paste it here. Okay, so now that we've created the action, we want to actually do it. If the action is delete transaction, or if the action type is delete transaction over here, so then we'll delete the transaction. So we'll check case delete transaction, which is we just automatically imported from /actions, which is the action that we just created right now. So we're checking if the type is delete transaction, then we want to actually delete the transaction. So if the case is if the action type is delete transaction, then we want to delete the transaction. So we want to return a copy of the state. So return state, and all of this would be put inside the object. So a copy of the state, and then we want to change the value of transactions. So the transactions, and we want to filter the transactions. We want to remove the transaction with the ID that has been passed in. So we'll do transactions.filter. Sorry, state.transactions. I want to get the transactions from state, and then we'll filter them, and it will give us the transaction one by one. So transaction arrow function, and then if the transaction.id, so transaction.id is not equal to the action.payload, which is going to be the ID of the transaction we want to delete, then we'll return the transaction, and then it will be set inside transactions. And we'll do this for each one. It will check if the ID is not equal to this, then which is the ID that we want to delete, then we'll return it inside transactions. So basically all of them would be returned other than the one we want to delete. So let's save this, and now we can go to main.js and want to dispatch this to props, this delete transaction. So we'll do delete transaction, and this would be an arrow function, and we'll receive the ID, sorry, not transaction, and we'll dispatch the delete transaction action. So enter, and that would automatically import it from Redux actions, and then we'll pass in the ID to this delete transaction. So now we have set this delete transaction action, we have set it up. Now we want to pass it into the transactions list. So let's actually pass it in as props. So delete transaction is equal to, we need to get this transaction with the object destructuring, so delete transaction, and then when we pass it in, we want to receive an ID, and then we'll call the delete transaction. So we'll pass in the ID, which is this delete transaction, which is being received as props over here, and this would be called, and we'll pass in the ID, and it would do what we just done in the reducer. So now in transactions list we are receiving the delete transaction. So now we are receiving the delete transaction, and now we want to do the same thing as we've done inside main.js, because we want to pass in this delete transaction to the actual transaction. So delete transaction is equal to the same thing as we've done. We'll receive the ID, and then we'll call the delete transaction function and to pass in the ID. Let me just clean this code, just like I said, Option Shift F or Alt Shift F if you're on Windows, if you have installed the extension, this one. And okay, so let's go back to our transactions list. And so now we're passing in the delete transaction. So now inside the transaction.js, we also want to receive the delete transaction prop, and then we'll do the same thing as we've done with the add transaction. We just want to call this. So on the click of this delete button, we want to call an arrow function, and then we'll call this delete transaction function, and we'll pass in the transaction ID. So transaction.id. Okay, so let me just explain this again. So when I did Option Shift F, this came up. I'm just going to delete it. We don't need it. So let me just explain again what's going to happen. So this transaction, each transaction has a delete button. When you click on it, it calls this delete transaction and passes in the ID of the transaction, which passes it into our transactions list, which receives it and then passes it also delete transaction and passes in the ID, and this is passed into the main.js, and the main.js receives the ID and also passes it into the delete transaction function from Redux, and then the Redux dispatches this delete transaction and passes in the ID, and then would receive it over here. The ID would be as set as payload, and the type would be delete transaction, and then the reducer would be returning the state and would filter the transactions based on the ID. So now let's actually see if this works. So let's go to our Chrome, and now we have this delete button. So if I click this, as you can see, it has been deleted and the balance has been updated as well.